Exodus chapter 17. I'm trying to work on making these notes a lot more nice to look at. But Exodus chapter 17, super exciting chapter. Verses 1 through 2. The Israelites traveled following God's guidance. So they were going through the wilderness and they were trying to get to Canaan still. They're on their journey and they're following God, which could be very daunting at times. And they camped at Rephidim, which I looked up the meaning of that place that they camped at, and it means rest, which is the opposite of what they did there, but we'll talk about that in a second. And when they camped there, they had nothing to drink and they complained. And sometimes that happens to us. Again, sometimes we can be a little bit quick to judge the Israelites, but really we're the same, you know. We've been following God for a while and things are uncomfortable, and you know, as soon as they get a little bit more uncomfortable, we complain. And they were complaining against Moses, and Moses is like, I'm not God. And rightfully so, you know. He's like, if you grumble against, you know, if you're saying you're grumbling, then all this is against God and he hears you. So that's the place where they're at now. They complain to Moses due to lack of water, and again Moses asks, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? Verse 3, it says, but they were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled, why did you take us out of Egypt? And again, just like we talked about last chapter, if you didn't watch it, go check it out. But we tend to forget what God has brought us through, and sometimes when we're in a new situation, we forget how bad the previous situation was. We can get so caught up on, you know, moving to the next place and getting out of this uncomfortable situation that we're in, that we don't sit in what God is trying to teach us in that lesson of today. It's so important to learn the lesson of today and to not breeze through life waiting for, you know, only the comfortable parts of life. Growth happens in the uncomfortable parts of life. So I wrote, when we question God, we question his power. Sometimes we don't need our situation to change, but rather our mindset needs to change. And I try to really focus on my mind and my mindset, because if you can be like Paul was in a prison. Paul was in prison, right? He was imprisoned for something that he shouldn't have been. It was wrongful imprisonment. And he still wrote about being joyful and having joy in the midst of, you know, his situation. I recently heard that his cell was extremely small, had no windows, and apparently scholars believe that this town, like the sewer of the town, ran through where Paul was staying. So it was actually, you know, pretty gross where Paul was. And he still wrote that he had joy in all situations. So we need to find the joy. And I think that's why it's so important to find joy throughout your day. There's little things that I do throughout my day that I look forward to. You know, for example, for the morning is my cup of coffee, and then sometimes it's like my 10-minute yoga stretch or going for a walk, playing with my kids. I look forward to small little bursts throughout my day, and that keeps me going. So try to find a few things that you can sprinkle throughout your day that gives you joy and gives you peace, and keeps you content. Change your mindset. Verses 5 through 7, Moses turned to God, and God guided Moses. The Israelites grumbled, and Moses sought the Lord. Look at the difference. So instead of Moses, you know, grumbling as well, he went to God, and they could have gone to God. They could have prayed to God. So look at the difference between what the Israelites are doing in their time of need and what Moses is doing in that time of need. God instructed Moses to take his staff and some elders with him and to stand in front of the people to strike a rock, and water will come out. Moses called the place Massa, which means testing, and Meribian, which means quarreling. So, you know, again, God is doing another miracle for the Israelites, which is so cool. Water is coming from a rock. Another thing to add to their wondrous list of things that God has done for them. And God does these wondrous things for us too, but we often forget. And I just wanted to write, are you stuck? And I write this to myself, you know, I'm not accusing you. Are you stuck in the testing and quarreling cycle? Practice daily gratitude and remember how far God has brought you. Sometimes you're stuck, or maybe you're just feeling stuck in one spot or in the wilderness because you are being tested. You know, God tests us. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith. So God does not tempt us to sin, but he tests us. He sure tests us. He tests us to see, you know, our reaction and how we will act in certain situations. So remember that, you know, the next time that you're going through a hard time, God could be testing you. Check your attitude. Don't be stuck in the same spot because God is testing you and you're quarreling. You're not doing anything different. You're not going outside of your, you know, needs and meeting someone else's needs or looking to the needs of someone else. You're not praying and seeking God when life gets hard. Instead, you're kind of quarreling and grumbling against him. It took the Israelites 40 years to go from Egypt to Canaan. If they walked 1 mile per day, it should have taken 9 months. And I've even heard other references say it should have only taken several weeks. Of course, 1 mile per day is a very reasonable, slow pace to go. You know, only 1 mile per day, that's not bad. But if they had done that, it would have only taken 9 months rather than 40 years. That's half of someone's life. So don't be like the Israelites and get stuck in one place because you are grumbling against God and not being grateful and just, you know, picking out the negative parts of life rather than seeing everything he's brought you through. And even if life is hard right now, it's not always going to be like that. And we have to remember to love God just because he is God and not for what he can do for us. So I wanted to make a separate title for the second part of this chapter because I feel like it was in the same place, but it was a separate story. So the Amalekites defeated, and it was verses 8 through 16. Verse 8, the Amalekites attacked the Israelites, and again, Moses relied on God. He didn't rely on his own strength or his own wisdom. He turned to God as soon as there was an issue. Just to give you a play-by-play, verse 9, Moses said to Joshua, choose some men to fight the Amalekites. Moses will stand on top of a hill with the staff of God in his hands. That's what he was telling Joshua. Verse 10, Moses took Aaron and Hur with him to the hill. And I want you to ask yourself, who do you rely on in times of need? When sometimes we need to rely on people around us, people that we trust. Verse 11, as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. And when his hands went down, they were losing. So he had to stay in the posture of his hands elevated. Verse 12, Moses became tired, and they took a stone and put it under him and held each hand up until sunset. In verse 13, the Amalekites were defeated. Defeating the Amalekites meant supporting Moses. And this is key. So Joshua and his men could have been the best army, but they wouldn't have won if it wasn't for Moses and God working through him. It's important to have people that we trust that can support us. So who can you support? Okay, let me explain this and my thought process with this. So God could have easily just defeated the Amalekites, right? He's God. He can do anything. But why? Sometimes I think to myself, why God does specific things. And of course, we won't know everything about God, but I think God wanted to paint a picture here that, Moses needed support. He needed people to come alongside of him. He took Aaron and Hur. He didn't just take any, two people. He specifically trusted Aaron and Hur. And so it didn't say, I don't see anywhere in the text where God specifically told Moses to take Aaron and Hur with him. Maybe God did, maybe God didn't. But I think it's really important to think about who can you trust in your life that can support you during the hard times when you're going through something. They knew enough to put the stone under him so he can sit, and Aaron held one arm and Hur held the other. And together, Aaron, Hur, Moses, and Joshua, because Joshua went into battle, he led the men. They together, of course, with the guidance of God, defeated the Amalekites. And so it's really important to think of who can support you through a hard time. And not only who can support you through a hard time, but most importantly, I always like to flip it around. Who can you support? It's really easy to get caught up in our needs and, this person's not there for me and this person's not there for me. And while it is extremely important to have people that you trust, people who can support you when you're going through, especially a hard time, think about who you can support. I recently was listening to a Bible study, and the pastor was talking about supporting and being there for the people that we don't typically think of. So for example, our parents and leaders, church leaders. You know, if you're looking at the Israelites and Moses, this was their way of supporting Moses. And a lot of times pastors and church leaders, they're very much so worn out, you know, anyone who is leading a ministry. But it's important for us to kind of think about that and think about other people that we could support. So like I said, pastors, any parents, do you know any parents they could probably use to support? My own parents, you know, your own parents. I'm an adult, and so my parents are older, obviously. And so sometimes I don't always think of my parents as being in need, and let me bless them. You know, it's good to think about those who are in need, definitely, and blessing them, but also think outside the box and bless those who you won't necessarily think of. I hope I'm explaining this well. I feel like I'm not. Moses wrote the event on a scroll just as God commanded, and it said make sure that Joshua hears it. And at first I thought, well, why? But then I figured it out. You know, we need to remember that it was God's power that caused the defeat of the Amalekites. So, you know, Joshua can't claim that, you know, well, me and my army, or, you know, we did this great battle. And while they did, but they couldn't have done it without God. And so remember that God is your source. You don't need to idolize the end of your journey. And this is something that I have learned this year so far. Well, two things. First of all, there really is no like end to your journey. I think as long as we're all living and breathing here on earth, there's always going to be that next thing that we're working towards. I feel like, at least that's how I am. But I would often idolize, you know, and I didn't realize I was doing this, the end of my journey, or the end results, or God's promise to me. And while there's nothing wrong with wanting those things, especially if God spoke it into your life, we need to remember to keep things in perspective, and to not make anything an idol before God, whether it is some sort of situation or a circumstance, a person, whatever it is, money, of course. Don't idolize anything above God. And for me, I had to realize that I can't idolize in a sense, getting to the end of what I want to get to. I need to enjoy the journey and trust the process. So that's all I have for today. Please let me know what you learned. I would love to hear. I post a new Bible study video Wednesdays and Fridays at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with an occasional bonus video on Mondays at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I can't wait to study the Bible with you again.